Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer lore. Today we are going to be covering the two new lords for Total War Warhammer. I'm speaking, of course, of Balthasar Gelt and Wurzzag, the Great Green Prophet. Now, these two are relatively minor characters, so I figured I'd do both of them in one video, because I am a good person, and I'd rather do one video than two. It has nothing to do with the fact that I simply can't be asked to edit two videos. Nothing at all. So, starting out with Gelt. Balthasar Gelt. I'm gonna say I was a little bit surprised by this one because, well, he is the Supreme Patriarch of the Colleges of Magic, and we'll get to that later, but I can't really imagine dear old Gelt just going off and raising an army to fight for the Empire just at the drop of a hat. And I really don't see him being the leader of the Empire. They might do some kind of mechanics, as they have already said, that you can recruit multiple lords, that once you eventually recruit Karl Franz, then he becomes the de facto faction leader, because really the only ones I could see keeping a political position, or in fact even just trying to wrest the title of Emperor away from Karl Franz with any kind of legitimacy would have to be one of the other elected counts. I can't really imagine the Empire, a very, very, very religious and very, on a base level, anti-magic nation, just accepting some random wizard as their new lord and master, but oh well. So, that aside, who is Balthasar Gelt? Well, that's a little bit of a complicated question. You see, we don't know that much about dear old Balthasar. We know that he originates from the seaport of Marienburg, or, well, if it originally is from there, we don't know, but at least that is the first mention we have of him in the story, where he paid his passage on a merchant ship that was heading to Altdorf with gold coins that he had transmutated from lead. Only one small problem with that. You see, when you transmute gold from lead, and you don't do it perfectly, which is extremely hard, and extremely intensive on the magic, it turns back into lead, so Balthasar figured that, you know what, the trip isn't that long, I'll just pay him in this magical gold and hope that I am way, way out of his reach by the time it turns back into worthless lead. And, well, he pulled it off. He managed to get off the merchant ship in one piece, but the captain was, well, miffed, let's just say, and put a bounty on Balthasar's head, a bounty that resides still to this day. So the current Supreme Patriarch of the Colleges of Magic, a very respected and public political position, has a bounty on his head, because, well, why not? You would maybe think that he'd have found some way of using his new political prestige and his newfound wealth to get rid of this bounty, but dear old Balthasar seems to find the whole thing vaguely amusing and hasn't really bothered to do so up until this point. But, of course, he didn't start out as Supreme Patriarch. He started out as just another lowly wizard in the Gold Order, a order of alchemists, essentially, with some magical doodahs on the side. Now, Gelt was a little bit unique, you see, because he took quite the interest in melding technology with magic, much along the same lines as what Clan Scryer and the Skaven Nation do, except, well, Gelt did it slightly more safely, although not by much. In fact, he has managed to blow up his lab with such a ridiculous frequency that the Imperial Fire Department pretty much has a permanent posting in his part of the building at this point. However, there are plenty of other insane individuals hanging around the Colleges of Magic and the Imperial School of Engineers that it's not even that unique, and he has managed to get himself quite a few friends, as he has in fact refined the production and effectiveness of black powder to no small degree, which earned him quite a few additional friends over at the college. But of course, the whole experimenting with black powder and magic and gold magic and explosive doodahs has a few risks associated with it. And while Balthasar had gotten pretty damn good at getting out of the way of any incoming projectiles and potential explosions, his luck eventually ran out and he got caught in the blast of one of his more ludicrous experiments. This permanently disfigured him and is why he now permanently wears a mask, and no one has actually seen him without the mask since. However, this being the Warhammer world, one has to ask oneself a couple questions. First and foremost, well, there's still a bounty on his head, so maybe the explosion wasn't entirely accidental. And secondly, we're talking about a gold wizard here who has so far gotten out of the way of every other explosion. One has to wonder if perhaps this explosion wasn't also a success. Perhaps he pushed his research just a little bit too far. Perhaps underneath that mask there is no longer a human at all. But that is all wild speculation, naturally. What we do know, however, is that Balthasar Gelt apparently became a fair bit more powerful after this accidental explosion, and actually went on to defeat the current Supreme Patriarch of the Colleges of Magic, a bright wizard by the name of Thyrus Gorman, who had actually held the position for a considerable amount of time. Now, that leads us naturally to the question, how does one become Supreme Patriarch of the Colleges of Magic? Perhaps there is an exciting rap battle somewhere in here, or maybe there's just some kind of theses and a voting. No, of course not. This is the Warhammer world, which means that every 8 years, the current Supreme Patriarch is opened up to challenges from other potential wizards who will then attempt to beat the shit out of him with his staff, or potentially a magic-confused staff and some other nonsense. And not too much is actually known about this ritualistic little duel, except for the fact that there does not appear to be all that many rules. Something that suited Balthasar just fine, and he did in fact, as I mentioned, end up winning the duel. Now, when one becomes Supreme Patriarch, first and foremost, of course, the position comes with a fair few benefits, including a rather considerable political prestige and position, as well as a pretty nice bump in one's income. But it also comes with the staff of Volonus, the original founder of the Colleges of Magic. And seeing as Volonus was taught by Teclix himself, the greatest elven mage ever to have walked the Warhammer world, or at the very least, arguably the best one could definitely go into a fair bit of arguments about the whole elven magic thing, seeing as these little bastards seem to lower and raise their power level based entirely upon what the author requires of them. A little bit of a Superman thing there. And it seems relatively fair to assume that, as such, the Staff of Volonus is probably a pretty damn powerful magical item and not purely a symbol of status and position. And in fact, Balthasar Gelt has repeatedly shown his prowess on the battlefield, helping out the Empire's armies. And that is where the current story of Balthasar Gelt comes to an end. And I know what you're thinking, no, we will not be touching upon the end times, even though I have to admit, part of the reason why I dislike Gelt is because of what he did in the end times, which was just such a ridiculous thing, and yet somewhat fitted into his character. To give you the short story, essentially, he kind of just betrayed the Empire and became a necromancer, because why the hell not? And seeing as he has always been a bit of a shady individual, I guess it kind of makes sense, but at the end of the day, fuck the end times. So we'll be moving on to the Great Green Squig Spammer. Warzag, or Vorosag Ura Sahubu, to give him his full, somewhat nonsensical name, often also known as the Great Green Prophet, or in gaming circle as that bastard who turned my wizard into a squig, is an enormously powerful savage orc shaman, and, like all orc shamans, completely and utterly batshit insane. The fact that he's also a savage orc, a subspecies of orcs not exactly known for their balanced state of mind, probably didn't help either. Now, the story of Vorosag starts out somewhat anticlimactically, with him getting his green arse kicked out of his own tribe, after which he wandered the great green jungles of the Southlands, somehow not getting nommed on by the various life forms that inhabit the jungle, and all of which are considerably larger than a single orc. He eventually stumbled across a magical mask, known as the Baleful Mask. Yes, I know, it's very fitting. So, having acquired himself a brand spanking new Zulu mask, Warzag received a vision from the gods. Probably because he's been starving for the last few years and he finally just stumbled across a piece of wood and undoubtedly hit his head when he fell over, but oh well. He received a vision from Gork and Mork to go and find the once and future Git. To help him in this task, he was also given the Bonewood Staff, a magical weapon that grants magical resistance to Warzag, along with a special magical war paint that imparts a 5+ ward save, and Whizbang, the power squig, which is that lovely little animal between his legs there, and no, I know where your brain just went, don't even begin there. Unfortunately, Whizbang has been somewhat nerfed over the last years and now only stores 1 additional power dice, and Warzag, the Great Green Jesus, has also lost a few other of his fancy little special ability. Back in 6th edition, he also used to have a wonderful little special ability called Tastes Bad, which is probably the reason why he survived the jungles for so long. It essentially meant that enemy mounts and monsters halve their attacks, rounding down, if in base contact with Warzag, which means that a giant dragon would essentially just give him a single nom, and if he somehow survives, it would just go like, you know what? I am not eating that. You stab it with your sword or something, High Elf Dragon Prince. You always riding my back and bitching at me. You kill him for once. And another fanciful little rule that was called Shamanistic Rivalry. You see, Warzag is a vengeful little fucker, and figured that, I will get kicked out of my tribe once, I'm not gonna let this happen again, and as such, if an army that included Warzag had another shaman in it, you had to roll a dice, and if your dice ended up as a 1, that shaman got turned into a squig. And squigs are sadly not particularly magical beings, and are probably not going to be able to fulfill the shaman's intended role. To make up for this, however, he has a special new rule called Warzag's Revenge, which has a chance of turning enemy wizards that try to kill Warzag by engulfing him in flame or, turning him into a nice fluffy sheep, into squigs, which, as we have already mentioned, is not a particularly good thing. And it's especially a rather shitty thing when you consider that at least if he turns your own wizard into a squig, well, at least you got a squig out of it. In this case, however, he could suddenly turn that very, very expensive level 4 wizard you made into a squig that will then, of course, begin trying to nom the soldiers that just a moment ago were his personal bodyguard, and, well, in general, soldiers tend to have a somewhat adverse reaction to having a giant red gummy ball biting them in the arse, and it tends to end poorly for the gummy ball. Luckily for us, little Warzag doesn't have a whole lot of end times lore, and we can be very happy about that. In fact, the only real end times lore he got was that Gork and Mork, being the scatterbrained little monkeys that they are, decided that he doesn't have to look for one new champion, the once and future Git. He has to find 2 of them, because of course he does, and then I guess they can fight for the title or something along those lines. And the champions, of course, ended up being Grimgor Ironhide and Skarsnik, the Night Goblin Chieftain. Now, what confuses me here is that Vorosag have been looking for these champions for a decade or so, and he has yet to manage to find Skarsnik, who hasn't moved from the same spot for the last 10-12 years at this point, and has not found Grimgor either, Probably the most famous orc to have ever birthed himself out of the cold hard ground where all orcs originate from. So one has to question Wurzag's competence, but hey, after all, he used to be a starved, crazy shaman stumbling through the jungle until he finally fell over and hit his head on a mask, so I guess we can't really expect too much out of him. And that has been it. That has been the stories for Balthasar Gelt and Wurzzag the Great Green Prophet. Two relatively minor characters this time around. I do hope that we're going to be seeing more Lord level characters with some cool and interesting special abilities in the future, but I do hope we're going to see someone that makes a little bit more sense rather than Balthasar Gelt taking over the Empire and Wurzzag the Great Green Idiot stumbling through the jungle taking over the Orc Horde from Grimgore Ironhide. Now that is a duel I would love to see, as I'm pretty sure the Bonewood staff would be shoved so far up Wurzag's ass that the skull on top would be speaking for him. I have been Arch, thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Have a good day.